Idsworth. I rather suspect that the manner by which I came to discover Idsworth is exactly the same as many other people. It was November 1970. I had just returned on my first ship from a 16th month deployment to the Far East on a quarter train from Portsmouth heading for Waterloo. It was late autumn, early afternoon, and a typical English misty day, and I was glorying in the greenness of my homeland, which, after several weeks at sea and only a very swift call into Gibraltar, was, despite the lateness of the year, very verdant looking in the dampness, although the trees were inevitably fairly bare. Then all of a sudden I saw, high on a green down, this small, completely isolated church building. It was, of course, St Hubert's Chapel, Idsworth, as I later discovered on my return to Hampshire after Christmas, when I caught another train out to Rowland's Castle with my bike and went exploring in the snow. Idsworth lies in the hundred of Finchdean, the village which lies just a mile to the south of the church. The hundred, originally called Septune Hundred at Doomsday, spreads widely both to east and south. The church itself, reputedly built by Earl Godwin in about 1030, lies inevitably upon Church Down, where there was a Saxon hamlet in the 6th and 7th centuries. The well-known Portsmouth-born archaeologist Sir Barry Cunliffe, working at the time with Southampton University, carried out a dig here in the 1970s, discovering traces of 60 timber dwellings behind the church. However, these had been deserted long ago. The name Idsworth was first recorded as Hidisworth in 1170. It probably derived from the worth or curtilage, an area of land attached to a house, of a man called Idi or Hidi. The value of the hundred was assessed at the time of Edward the Confessor, prior to the conquest, as 53 hides, although this decreased following the Norman destruction of some Saxon people in the area. Idsworth itself was not specifically mentioned in the Domesday Survey and was almost certainly by this time subsumed within the manor of Chorlton. This manor occupied a large swathe of land stretching from Blendworth in the southeast quadrant to Clanfield in the northwest. The manor belonged to Earl Godwin, Earl of Wessex under King Canute, and passed to his son Harold in 1053. This important man, usually remembered as King Harold II, was King of England for just a short period in that critical year, 1066, until he died at the Battle of Hastings. Better known at the time as Harold Godwinson, using the older form of patronymic favoured by these former Scandinavian peoples, he was unfortunate to lose a battle which really could have gone either way. Following the conquest, the manor was inevitably seized by King William and passed to William Fitz-Osberg, Earl of Hereford, and also, perhaps more relevantly, Lord of the Isle of Wight. However, Fitz-Osberg seems to have held it only for a relatively short period, for by the date of the Domesday investigation, 1085 in this relatively civilised southern area of the country, Chorlton, including Idsworth, was held by the Earl of Shrewsbury, whose descendants eventually forfeited it, along with all his land and titles, to Henry I, following the third Earl's unsuccessful support for the 1101 invasion under Richard Curthose, Duke of Normandy. Following this, the manor was given to a succession of the king's supporters until, in the 13th century, Queen Eleanor, first and dearest wife of Edward I, gave it by tenure in Franulmine, in free arms. In other words, to be held by, in this case, Tarrant Nunnery in Dorset, so long as the nuns prayed for the soul of Queen Eleanor, and probably King Edward too, in perpetuity. This probably happened around 1260. These Cistercian abbesses, of reputedly the richest religious house in England, retained control of the manor as overlord until the dissolution of the monasteries under Cromwell, working for Henry VIII. The abbess at that time, Margaret Russell, had been elected to her high office in 1535, and surrendered the nunnery and all its belongings, including Idsworth, in 1539. She had resisted for quite a long time, however, as her deed of surrender was number 233, although in total over 800 religious establishments disappeared during this period. During the Commonwealth period, until the Restoration, the Manor of Chorlton was allocated to Oliver Cromwell and his heirs. Idsworth again passed through a number of hands in quick succession following the Restoration, until in 1577 it was acquired by the Bannister family. This family, suspected of supporting Mary Queen of Scots, suffered during Elizabeth's reign. However, in 1613 a daughter, Mary Bannister, married Robert Dormer, younger son of the first Lord Dormer of Wing, and this family built an extensive manor house close to the Saxon chapel in an area now known as Old Idsworth. This, the now demolished Old Idsworth house, replaced an even older building upon the site, probably a farm building, but by this period the village had migrated a little further to the south. The original Old Idsworth house and its gardens, which can in part still be seen and visited, was constructed, according to Historic England, in the mid-16th century, and they report that in 1715 the tree-lined avenues were planted, and by 1830 the parkland contained various tree species. The lime tree avenues were replaced later in the 19th century. This older house was demolished in 1840 to make way for the railway. And this new substantial house, with the capacity to hold a large family and up to 11 living servants, never mind the daily staff, was built in 1852. There is some evidence of a small 9th century village in the vicinity of the chapel. However, this had disappeared by the end of the 14th century, possibly as a direct or more likely an indirect result of the plague, which definitely affected the non-land-owning peasantry, who literally could and did up sticks and move to where they could command the best returns for their labour, now in much greater demand due to the shortage of suitable fit working men. The Bannister and Dormer families held Idsworth for a total of 370 years, and its relatively isolated position must have been very useful, for both families were staunch but secretive Catholics. There is evidence of a Civil War skirmish in the fields north of South Holt Farm, where 340 musket balls were discovered, but it seems to have passed without note, since no records of a battle in this area can be discovered online. In 1789, Charles, 8th Lord Dormer, sold the Manor of Idsworth and Holt North Marden, estates in Idsworth, Chorlton and Holt North Marden, Stoughton and Compton, to Jarvis Clarke of Belmont in Bedhampton. Listeners might possibly remember this was the estate where the Prevost family that I spoke about in our February meeting lived a little later. A decade earlier than this purchase, Jarvis had bought the nearby Manor of Chorlton and also the Manor of Five Heads to the west of Blendworth. The purchase of Idsworth actually cost Jarvis only half the price, since his son Sam, to whom we will return in a moment, had contributed half of the money. Jarvis Clarke was the son of Samuel Clarke and Elizabeth Jarvis. Her family, slightly higher in society than her husband's, had owned extensive property in Hampshire and Wiltshire since the 16th century, and several members of that Jarvis family had been elected to Parliament. When Clarke inherited other Jarvis properties, the terms of the will allocating this required him to add Jarvis to his surname. Thus he acquired the somewhat Woosterish full name of Jarvis Clarke Jarvis. He married Kitty, the only daughter of Robert Warner, acquiring more estates, this time in Staffordshire. J.C. Jarvis was a significant figure in the local society and was a member of the prestigious Gentlemen's Dining Club at the Bat and Ball in Hambledon, which provided the initial financial backing for the famous Hambledon Cricket Club. He rose in prominence, eventually becoming president. president of the club for some years in the 1790s. In this role he was required to provide the venison for the annual dinner, but one year he failed to do so, and instead of being fined not only the usual dozen bottles of wine awarded for such a misdemeanour, but also a whole buck, as a result of which the club minutes record an additional meeting to be held to eat venison and drink Bonham's and Fitzherbert's claret. Upon his death in 1808, he was succeeded at Idsworth by his third son, the Reverend Samuel Clarke-Jervoise, again having added the additional surname upon acquiring the title, the son who had put up half of the money to buy the estate 2 decades before. He was the rector of Idsworth, Chorlton, Blendworth and Catherington, which would have meant a busy Sunday were it not for a succession of overworked and underpaid curates. In 1809, Thomas, Samuel's older brother, who like their younger sibling had been formally declared to be a lunatic, died. Samuel disputed his will, which granted lands around Blendworth, including the site of the present house, to other people. This suit took a long time to settle through the courts, and it was only in 1826 that Samuel finally gained full possession of the land including Idsworth. We will return to this family shortly, but first we should probably consider the chapel itself. Changes in ecclesiastical boundaries meant that as by 1831 the hundred had acquired the current name Finchdean, and now also contained the parishes of Blendworth, Burriton, Petersfield, Catherington and Clanfield. Over the next 10 years, 3 additional parishes were included within the hundred boundaries, namely Bramshott, Greatley and Liss, and Waterloo, constituted as a parish in its own right in 1858, completed the extent of the hundred. Historically, until 1864, Idsworth had been a parish, with a church dedicated to St Peter and St Paul, but it now falls within the parish of Chorlton, with the church reduced to the lesser status of a chapelry, dedicated nowadays to St Hubert. This came about when some very fine medieval war paintings in the church, dated to around 1330, which had been heavily whitewashed over during the reign of King Henry VIII, were uncovered in 1864 by the then incumbent, the Reverend J. Astley. Although it's now known that the paintings are illustrations of the life of John the Baptist, this particular upper section, which shows heavily forested undergrowth, was thought, in the late 19th century, to reflect a notable event in the life of St Hubert. Hubert, who became the Bishop of Liège in 708, was of Merovingian descent, who died on the 30th of May 727 at the age of 71, although interestingly he had almost died many years earlier at the age of 10 from fever. He was married to Floribane, daughter of Dagobert, the Count of Louvain, and like many of his compatriot aristocrats was very keen on hunting. When his wife died in childbirth, Hubert retreated from the court and took himself off to the forest of the Ardennes and gave himself up completely to hunting. On Good Friday, when everyone else was in church, he rode off after some prey. As he was chasing a magnificent stag, the creature turned and, according to the legend, between its antlers there was a crucifix. A voice told him to renounce his wicked ways and to seek out Lambert, the Bishop of Maastricht, to teach him to lead a more holy life. Thus Hubert became the patron saint of hunters and later of ethical hunters. In this December 2008 London Review of Books, there's a rather lovely poem regarding this story, written by John Burnside. I'm going to read it, although it's a bit slow. He has come to a halt in the woods, snow on the path, and everything gone to ground in its silken lair. Gone to ground or folded in a death so quiet he can almost taste the fade of hair and vein, of flesh gone into light. And water, part song, lost in all this glister. Nothing is less attractive than the heart, but we have to admire its utter disdain for comfort. Nothing is so relentless or intact, and death is its only precision. At the last, a voice will form beyond the empty trees, and something will glimmer away to the far edge of vision. The deer, perhaps, the deer, but not the prey he sought for years and cannot bear to master. If you wish to, you'll find that poem quite easily online, St Hubert and the Deer. This beautiful church is a stone and flint building, widened in the 16th century and significantly restored a number of times, most latterly shortly before the Great War. The church is a Grade 1 listed for a number of reasons, not least that it is of both architectural and historical interest. Pevsner and later English heritage tell us that it is a Saxo-Norman church, probably dating from the 10th century or earlier, with a chancel added in the 12th or 13th century. Although itself not especially large, it is unquestionably built upon the site of an earlier, smaller stone building. The nave was widened on the south side in the early 16th century. The church was repaired in 1793 and 1824, and the additional mid-century west porch is shown on a map of 1864. The church was once again restored and a vestry and organ gallery added in 1912 to 13 by the architect H.S. Goodhart Rendall for the Clarke-Jervoise family, the Baronet of Idsworth and sometimes MP for Hampshire South, to whom we will return in a moment. The vestry and chancel roof were restored following a fire in 1971, and the bell turret was restored in 1973. There's a small Norman window in the chapel and a Norman doorcase. However, the church also contains a 14th century font, a double-decker 17th century pulpit, 18th century box pews, bench ends and communion rails, a good quality plastered ceiling of early 20th century form, and an excellent pre-World War I wooden organ gallery. Without doubt, as you can see from this list, that this small church, standing lonely and apparently deserted in a field, has been well loved and well cared for throughout its long life. Before we investigate who paid for some of this work, let us discover something about the noted architect Harry Stewart Goodhart Rendall. He was born in 1887 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the son of Harry Chester Goodhart, an international football player, who later became a professor of Latin at Edinburgh University, and Rose Ellen Rendall, whose name he adopted as a double-barrelled addition by royal assent in 1902, a sensible improvement since when his grandfather, the first Baron Randall, died in 1945, he inherited a substantial estate, including Hatchlands Park near Guildford. When he restored St Hubert's, this was relatively early in his career, he having left Eton for Trinity College, Cambridge, at the turn of the century, and this was his first major work. However, he went on to much greater things later in life, becoming in 1933 Slade Professor of Fine Art, and was created CBE in 1955, mostly as a result of serving as the President of the Royal Institute of British Architects from 1937 until the start of World War II. To turn then again to the paymasters, the Clarke-Jervoise family. The Baronetage of Idsworth was created on the 13th of November 1813 for the Reverend Samuel Gervase, who was born Samuel Clarke and assumed the surname Jervis by royal licence in 1808. He lived from 70, and when he was granted the baronetcy in 1813, he was described as Samuel Clarke-Jervoise of Hanover Square, Idsworth Park and Woodford, which is in Essex. Although he was generally known as the Baronet of Idsworth, in 1817 he and his wife advertised Idsworth Park and Mansion with 300 acres of grassland to be let for 3 years, and Samuel's wife regularly complained about that dark, dank valley in Hampshire. As you can see from this entry in Debrett's, Samuel had a number of children, and when he resigned from all his parishes in 1834 and retired to his London, Essex and Brighton homes, he left Idsworth to his son. Another Jarvis Clarke-Jervoise, who was born in 1804. This chapter acted as a magistrate and sat on the Board of Guardians, although like many aristocrats, hunting and shooting to occur almost every day. Jarvis was succeeded on his death in 1889 by the third baronet, his son Arthur, born in 1856, his own son having died in 1872. Arthur himself died childless in 1902, after which the estate passed to his uncle Henry, then on his death 6 years later to Harry until 1911, Eustace, who appointed Goodhart Rendall to update the chapel, but who died not long after this was completed in 1916, and finally to Dudley, the seventh and final baronet, who died in 1933, leaving no legitimate heirs, and the death duties absorbed almost all of the value of the estate. These were all heirs of Samuel, Jarvis's younger brother, and all three had died within 14 years. This was effectively the end of the Idsworth estate, although Major Arthur Clarke-Jervoise, the reportedly illegitimate son of Arthur, the younger brother, bought the estate before the Second World War, but it was already a shadow of its former self and never truly recovered any real value. Arthur died rather unfulfilled in 1974, leaving no children. In order to put this talk together while sitting at home, it has been necessary to conduct extensive online and desk research in order to enable me to discover enough information to make this as interesting as possible. I am grateful for the assistance of Simon Knott, who runs the brilliant website for the late, great Tom Muckley, a journalist for the Petersfield Post, who wrote so much about this area of the country. Alan Drinkwater, the editor of the Rowland Castle Heritage Centre website, also asked me specifically to record that some of the information was courtesy of Guy Phelps and Rowland's Castle Heritage Centre. Information was also taken inevitably from the Victoria County History of Hampshire, Volume 3, pages 82 to 83, Historic England's Listed Builders database, and a number of other useful areas, including Wikipedia. Finally, Helen Ballum, HLB of the Hampshire History website, a voluntary organisation run by just two people who try to share their passion for our county as and when time permits, was extremely helpful, especially with regard to the medieval wall paintings in the chapel.